Dr. Don Chipman, my colleague from Oman, a very distinguished gathering here, even more distinguished by the presence of a very legendary name in international affairs, sitting in the front row. May I begin by thanking John for the invitation, but most of all by thanking His Majesty, the King of Bahrain, the Crown Prince, and the Foreign Minister for the extremely warm and generous hospitality, and for maintaining a conversation, a dialogue, a symposium, call it what you will, which has now acquired a very singular presence in the efforts to try and understand this increasingly complex world and try and find options. I'm not so optimistic as to call them solutions, and to find options through the process of dialogue. This is, as John said just now, the 13th, so it must be our lucky year. John, it is traditional to call the Middle East a part of India's extended neighborhood. The term extended is interesting in itself because implicit in the term is that there is also a tended neighborhood. And given the tendencies that we see in many neighborhoods, maybe the time has come to examine what precisely do we mean when we use the term neighbor. We almost always measure, or we always describe or measure the meaning of a neighbor with distance. Is that sufficient anymore? I would suggest that we extend the meaning of neighbor and also use the term reach. Distance is clearly not enough. Can we reach our neighbor or not? That is probably more important than distance. There are countries that are very close to each other but never reach each other. Or if they do reach each other, it is really through the ice flow of a freeze. Distance and reach really require reinterpretation. It often strikes me the distance from Delhi to Dubai is 3 flying hours. The distance from Dubai to Cairo is also 3 flying hours. But Cairo is seen as a neighbor, and Delhi is seen in terms of distance. There are hundreds of flights now, many hundreds, between India and the Gulf region every week. I can't count, even on the fingers of one hand, the number of flights that we might have with one neighbor. So what then is the meaning of being a neighbor? A neighbor must not only be described by distance. A neighbor also has to be someone who shares the same or similar values. Because without sharing the values, the neighborhood doesn't improve. Or we cannot find either a commonality of views or indeed the will to have course correction when we require it. Second point on the same subject. Human beings have become land animals. We are so trapped by the presence of land in almost everything, whether it's in industry, agriculture, culture, demographics, living, that we quite forget that there is more than one map to the world. India has a land map, which is familiar. You think of India, you think of an inverted triangle. But a neighborhood can no longer be defined only by land map. India, like so many other countries, also has a sea map. And the sea map now is increasingly becoming a very important fact in our definition of who is a nation to engage with and who not. The sea map of India extends to the waters not far from here, right up to the Malacca Straits. The theme of our foreign policy, as defined by our Prime Minister, is shared values, common destiny. What are the values that we talk about? The most important of these values, in our view, is nationalism and pluralism. What is the principal objective that we all have when we talk of a common destiny in the 21st century? If there are always many aspirations, many objectives that nations will have, but if you had to pinpoint one thing that we all have or should have in common, it is a desire for prosperity. And prosperity by itself is insufficient. It has to be shared prosperity. And when we talk of shared prosperity, we do not merely mean shared prosperity between nations. We have to have shared prosperity even within our countries. In fact, on an aside, one of the more pernicious theories of economic policy, at least in my personal view, is this view of a trickle-down theory. What does this trickle-down theory, advertised so often, mean? It really means that those who have swimming pools will get a waterfall, and those who are dying of thirst will get a trickle. That is not sustainable. And what then is the principal threat to the common objective of prosperity? And why then is partnership so important in this process? The most menacing threat to the desire for prosperity is conflict. And this conflict, the worst example, the worst manifestation of this conflict now is terrorism. Terrorism, at the United Nations, all of this distinguished audience is well aware that since 1996, the United Nations has been trying to search for a definition for terrorism. We'll soon be celebrating the 25th anniversary of yet another failure. And I often wonder, how do you confront an enemy you can't define? But be that as it may, through our different experiences, we also know that when we see terrorism, we can recognize it. The question that I would like to pose here is, do terrorists have serious political objectives or not? Or is this merely a desire for chaos for the sake of chaos? And I urge you that terrorists do have very serious political objectives. The first objective that they have is the destruction of the nation state. Now, the nation state itself is a comparatively modern phenomenon. In the last 100 years, we have seen 4 world wars. The First World War, the Second World War, and the interlinkages between the two are very well known. The Second World War was quickly followed by the Third World War, which was the Cold War. The Cold War may have been very cold in Europe, but it was very, very hot in Southeast Asia. It was very hot in Latin America. It was very hot in Africa. And maybe the Third World War began where the Second World War ended, which was at Yalta. And if, for theory's sake, the Third World War ended in Afghanistan, then the Fourth World War, which is the war against terrorism, began precisely where the Third World War ended. What are the objectives? The first objective is the destruction of the nation state, because the nation state is now the principal building block of the architecture of stability across the world. And the nation state is no longer being shaped by the will of elites. It has been shaped by something again unusual in history, which is the will of the people. The nation state has replaced the age of empire and the age of colonization. Terrorists seek to replace the nation state with faith-based space. This is what we have seen with Daesh. This is what we are seeing with Boko Haram. This is what we are seeing in the efforts. And why do they believe, why do they think that they can achieve this? Because the essential ideology of terrorism is faith supremacy. And if the value system that we have spoken about has to have meaning, then we know that pluralism means faith equality rather than faith supremacy. The second, and this is what makes terrorism into an existential problem, is the desire of terrorists to destroy the pluralism and harmony of societies that have achieved this with great effort. It hasn't been easy. Destroy it with the poison of fear, and fear induced through arbitrary, random violence. The violence is random, the violence may be arbitrary, but the purpose is not. And we can see the impact that this is having in societies and in political systems everywhere. Partnership. When we talk of partnership, are we only talking about government-to-government partnership, or are we also talking about people-to-people partnership? One of the finest examples of people-to-people partnership is really the partnership that has been created between India and the Gulf. 9 million, or perhaps more, Indians today are working here, and working here in peace. Compare this to the fact of turbulence all across Europe. Turbulence caused by fears of immigration, fears of jobs being lost. True, odd parallels are not exact. But yet, the fact that people here and these relationships here have been developed, they have been developed through something that is being discounted in this cynical world, and which is the power of cultural harmony, the power of shared philosophy, and the power of shared humanitarian approach. When we talk of a people-centric approach to foreign policy, then I'll just give you a very practical example of what we mean by it. Let us look at Yemen. We all know that there are efforts being made by side X or side Y to create a certain kind of government. But while we are engaged in this, we have completely forgotten that Yemen is something more than the exercise in government formation. There are 20 million human beings there in urgent need of food, shelter, and medicine. And of these, 11 million are children. 400,000 or 500,000 maybe are facing severe malnutrition. How much attention are we actually paying this? Remember this fact before your next dinner. Once we change the perspective of the way we begin to look at the world, we find that there is far more material for building bridges than there is for creating conflict and creating disharmony. In fact, when we attack terrorists. I would even suggest or even insist on saying that the elimination of terrorism is the biggest service to human rights. If life is the first and most fundamental of human rights, then those who seek to destroy life definitely need to be held accountable, and held accountable in any way possible. Pluralism is a fact of almost every philosophy that we can think of. I, as a Muslim, am very proud to say that the finest example of pluralism was in the Medina model of the Holy Prophet, where people of all communities lived with each other, lived alongside each other, where certainly there were places of worship for all the communities. And if we do not, as all of us, reassert our commitment to pluralism, to the Medina model, call it what you will. Everyone will find their own phrases, their own terms. Then we will have lost not just the battle on the battlefield, we will have lost the battle somewhere much more important, which is in the mind. Ladies and gentlemen, nations today are no longer big and small. Nations are sovereign, nations are equal. All nations have the same rights and indeed the same obligations. What we do have is a difference in capacities. What we do need to do is to find ways and means of sharing the capacities in order to build shared and common prosperity. India recognizes and stands by the Gulf region in its efforts to counter emerging security threats. However, while engaging with the Gulf countries, India's approach has to remain and will remain non-intrusive, non-judgmental, and non-prescriptive. We do not take sides in intra-regional disputes. Despite the current regional flux, we have progressively structured closer ties with all countries in the region towards safeguarding mutual benefits in political, trade and investment, energy, diaspora, and security interests. And what we do continue to seek is partnership and cooperation in the struggle and in the fight against international terrorism, and of course, byproducts of crime like maritime piracy and secure sea lanes. Specifically in forging security partnerships with the countries of the Gulf, various agreements that provide the framework of security cooperation have either been signed or under discussion, such as the extradition treaty, treaty on mutual legal assistance, on security cooperation, on combating crime. For example, the agreement on security cooperation with UAE, signed in 2011, provides for cooperation to combat terrorism, organized crime, drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, money laundering, economic crimes, and cyber crimes. And cyber crimes are really looming ahead of us. The state visit of the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi in January 2017 to Delhi provided further impetus in the area of defense cooperation, wherein the two sides renewed their commitment to strengthening the existing cooperation in training, joint exercises, and participation in defense exhibitions. In Saudi Arabia, there is increasing focus on defense cooperation, the foundation for which was laid during the Delhi Declaration in 2006 and further strengthened during our Prime Minister's visits. An MOU on defense cooperation was also signed by the then Crown Prince and Defense Minister, Prince Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, to India on February 2014. Oman is one of our closest defense partners in the region. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, we are here with a focus on the Middle East. And the question we really need to ask, what is the Middle East in the middle of? Is it truly in the middle of the East? Doesn't seem so each time I look at the map. In fact, if you want to find the true middle of Asia, you'll have to come to my country, India. India is the middle of the East. We all know that Asia is a Greek concept, which kept adding geography to its term with increasing exploration by Europe. But, we can't be trapped by the age of exploration. I would suggest that if you stand in Delhi and look west, much to our regret, and this is the problem I think that brings us together, if you stand in Delhi and look west, you'll find increasing space being occupied by great turbulence. But if you stand from India and look east, you will find nations with completely different demographics, completely different, cultures. In fact, there are there are more Muslims living between India and Indonesia than living between India and Morocco. So you find people of all faiths, Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, and indeed, you find the largest collection of atheists in history also. They're in China. But they have one thing in common, and that is we all believe that yes, there is partnership possible, there is cooperation possible despite our differences in the search for prosperity. We believe that the basic impetus of diplomacy is to prevent differences from becoming disputes and disputes from becoming conflicts. This is the spirit which we hope will engage us all as we look and search for and find, I hope, common values and a common destiny. Thank you.